After sin, did God remove from Adam and Eve original grace and all the consequences that come with it? Well, the answer is yes. And it's something real. So to understand it, one must remember what it is that the original grace and this image of a fountain of champagne as we see in weddings with a glass at the top. We pour the champagne, it flows in the glasses of the floor below and then in the floors below, more and more wide, so that all the glasses are filled. It was like this, with Adam and Eve, the presence of God made their intelligence bright, their will perfectly free, so that their psychology, on the next floor, was entirely obedient to their spirit and floor below, that their bodies were perfectly healthy and even immortal since God would have come to fetch them before their death. Still, even more so, nature itself was in harmony with them, so radiant were they with this grace of the presence of God. God removes His presence, it is the glass above. There is no champagne left. And suddenly, all floors are reached. For intelligence, they immediately begin to ignore what God was. Yet they frequented Him a few minutes before. But right now, they are afraid of it. They are afraid of His reaction, of His revenge. They hide themselves from their presence, says the text of Genesis, in the garden. Their will itself becomes undermined. It means that while their command was to love this God they knew, since they frequented Him and loved each other, they began to accuse each other of sin. Adam says, "It was Eve who deceived me." Eve says it's the snake that cheated on her. They do not assume their responsibilities. Their will becomes false, treacherous. Another consequence is their psychology. She no longer obeys entirely. Except they partly master it, but like a disobedient horse. They make the same experience. They discover that they are naked. What does it mean? Well, while naturally they were pure in front of each other, they start to feel animal desires that make them ashamed, because that's not it, to go from a very large floor holiness to, I would say, such bestiality, at least desires within their hearts, makes them ashamed. So they dress. Another consequence in their biological body, which becomes fragile, capable of falling sick. Their health diminishes. There are even consequences in the Bible delivery, you will give birth in pain. We must first see a spiritual sense. Eve will give birth to children who will kill each other. But there is also a physical sense, the body is reached and it is reached until the physical death happens because God does not come to seek them, their immortality is thus disappeared. It is the natural laws of biology that are exercised. They do not have an assumption, as the Virgin Mary will know it later. Finally, the last floor, nature becomes hostile. The animals that respected them, who were fascinated by the light emanating from them flee them, actually flee them. They can even attack them. Nature no longer delivers its fruits like that. They will be confronted with all this. Following the sin, has death entered the world? This is what St. Paul says. He says, by the fault of one, death has entered the world. So, there is a dogma really, of the Catholic Church that death came into the world from the sin of Adam and Eve, which concretely means that Adam and Eve were immortal. Some have thought that if they were immortal they lived in another world than the biological world, a parallel world with spiritual bodies. No. It was the same world as us. They ate. It was the same world as us, they were reproducing. They should have done it before the original sin, which implies biology. But the image we have, the closest to what Eve was, is Mary, the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary is in our world. Except that it is a sinful world when Mary in herself was as immaculate as Eve. So suddenly, relying on this dogma, some Catholics said, at the time the animals were not carnivorous, they ate only grass and nothing was lost in the world and the world was truly alive. They also thought of another parallel world. The answer is no. This is not the correct interpretation. When the world says that death has entered the world through the fault of one, it is a dogma about salvation. It is not about biology, science, animal life. So it's about the man and the woman. It is the death of man and woman that has entered the world, first the spiritual death, the sin mortal, and then their biological death that should not intervene. When it comes to animals, plants, you have to look at what science says. We are Catholics, that means in a vision where science and faith walk together as two affectionate people. Science shows that from the beginning of the world, from the Big Bang, the world is corruptible, galaxies appear and they die, others reappear. And when life appears on Earth, it is subject to death. The Earth is only a succession of life and death, of passing generations. The species themselves disappear, and that, since 4.5 billion years. In fact, the whole matter of our world is subject to what is called entropy, that is to say, it tends to disorder, it is corruptible, and it was well before Adam and Eve. So, what would have happened to Adam and Eve if they were immortal? Well, first of all, throughout their lives, they would have been protected by the angels. Accidents that can kill because their body was ours, a biological body. The Psalm says it, I carried you in my hands lest your feet strike a stone. The presence of God emanating throughout their body protected them from diseases. And when the old age, or rather the maturity of their body, would have reached a certain level, and quite simply, God would have come to seek them. He would have put them on incorruptibility, and He would have taken them to the next world in the beatific vision, so that the earth would not have been too populated. The earth was only intended as a passage, and we see it, they would not have gone through death. For the Virgin Mary it is different, because she is Immaculate Conception, she is immortal in the same way, but she was born in a world afflicted by sin, just as her Son was not to die but to rise to heaven without passing through death, but he chose to die. So a tradition in the East says that, worn, destroyed by what she had lived to passion a few years ago, the Virgin Mary died. Did she die 3 days before being resurrected and ascended to heaven? Was it just a sleep, a dormition? We do not know. The dogma is not pronounced. All that the dogma says is that it went up to heaven with its body and soul, as it should have been the case for Adam and Eve.